Joining us today is David Korn. He's D.C. Bureau Chief with Mother Jones. He's also an MSNBC analyst. Broke a really interesting story yesterday at Mother Jones on a conservative messaging group called Groundswell. So I guess my first question is, can you give us a primer kind of on what Groundswell is?
Groundswell is a messaging strategy coalition, kind of hush-hush, wasn't announced really to the world, that was set up by some conservatives after the Republican defeat last year's election. And some prominent people who came together to do this include Ginni Thomas, who is the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who's been a Tea Party organizer and a lobbyist fighting Obamacare for the last couple of years. John Bolton, who used to be the UN ambassador for the United States in the Bush years. Frank Gaffney, who is I think it's fair to say, an anti-Islam activist who sees Sharia law wherever he turns. Alan West, former congressman, Tea Party favorite. Several guys from Breitbart News, including Steve Bannon, the CEO there, Matt Boyle, one of their ace reporters, and Mike Flynn, a reporter columnist for them. Mark Tapscott, who is the editor of the Washington Examiner, which is a conservative paper here in town, participated for a couple of sessions, but then he told me that he pulled out because he thought it wasn't appropriate for a journalist to be involved. Why wouldn't it be appropriate? Because what's happening in these meetings are that all these advocates for particular causes and groups, for voter identification programs on the right, and people are trying to gin up the scandal, pseudo-scandal, I would say, about Benghazi and all those things, are sitting around hatching talking points, messaging points, strategies for beating back progressive groups, congressional Democrats, the White House, but also, interestingly enough, Karl Rove. These guys hate the Republican establishment, and they hate Karl Rove most of all, in part because he's been out there for a couple months now saying, we got to make sure, we Republicans that is, that we don't nominate people who are too strident, too far to the right, and lose the chance to bring in independent and more moderate voters, even more moderate Republicans. And the Tea Partiers, Ginni Thomas and others, can't stand that to such an extent that one of the major thrusts of this group, Groundswell, was the Karl Rove Project, which they described. And people can go to motherjones.com. I put all these memos up, so I don't even have to take my word for it. But they describe a two-front war against Karl Rove. What are the two fronts? Destroying his reputation. They want to make him toxic, their word, among the grassroots, Republican conservative grassroots. The other front in this two-front war is financial. Ken Blackwell, who used to be Secretary of State in Ohio, very prominent conservative African-American, another Tea Party favorite, took on the job of going to donors to Karl Rove's super PAC and leaning on them to try to prevent, encourage them not to contribute to the American crossroads. And so they're trying to, tar Karl Rove, reputation-wise, and they're trying to dry up his money. So if you take a step back and think about this, we got like a cage match or a civil war on the right between Ginni Thomas, wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, and a Tea Party organizer in her own right, versus Karl Rove, the guy who got George Bush elected and and really helped create the sort of the modern right to benefit the Republicans. It's fascinating stuff.
So this is basically the crowd that says Mitt Romney lost because he was not conservative enough.
Yes, their talking points and their memos. Again, I put up a lot of these memos, motherjones.com, you can find them. But again and again, they talk about clueless Republican leaders. They hate John Boehner for not being more confrontational with President Obama. They want more confrontation. They hate the autopsy report that the GOP put out at the beginning of the year that said we have to, appeal to a wider range of voters, including minorities. They're very disparaging of Reince Priebus, the GOP party chair, and they scoff at him, saying, "God, if we were gay illegal aliens, then he would love us." And so, they say quite clearly the issue is the party has to be more libertarian, more conservative, than Mitt Romney or than Karl Rove would even want. So you're talking. I mean, Karl Rove is a conservative. He would tell you he's a conservative. He's Grover Norquist, Ralph Reed, the guys who work with Karl Rove. They would all say they're conservatives. He is a conservative. But this group Groundswell, with Alan West, Ginni Thomas, Frank Gaffney, and Breitbart News folks, they all say they're squishy. They're not conservative enough. And that's the problem that Republicans have.
One of the interesting things in your report, one of the messages came from a Breitbart reporter who said, keep us on offense, them on defense. Even if the idea isn't perfect, I could help massage it to get there. So it seems like there's some syncing going on with journalists and this group. Can you explain that?
I would say it looks like there's collusion. You quoted Matt Boyle, who's one of the lead reporters for Breitbart News. But in this instance, you have these reporters and the chair of Breitbart News participating, colluding, scheming with, ideological advocates and partisans, which is something I've never done. None of my reporters at Mother Jones, would do and wouldn't be allowed to do. And, I published in the stories examples of when they're trying to come up with the best messaging for their voter identification campaigns. People on the left would call them voter suppression campaigns. Without even getting into that fight, you have Matt Boyle and Mike Flynn being part of the thread on the Google groups back and forth. How do we call this thing? People don't, we're being tarred as being racist and being against the vote. So should we call ourselves voter rights advocates? Should we say election integrity? And they're participating in that. And the quote that you just read was Matt Boyle saying, hey, give me your stories, even if they're not great, I can help you massage them so that they're representable. And that is, I think, a degree of scheming that goes beyond what would be appropriate. In this town, reporters are always talking to politicians and advocates. What stories do you have? What do you have? You got half a story, let me know. Maybe I can develop it further. All that type of stuff. But in the context of attending meetings and being a regular amongst, a group that is, that has been created to work on messaging. I mean, that's the thing. It's in some ways, you could call it propaganda without being pejorative. In fact, they have said, we're losing the propaganda battle. There's an interesting part in the memo too. One of the memos, I had dozens, scores of memos. I had over 1,000 pages of material from this group, in which they're talking about how we've lost, the war, the messaging war, the propaganda battle with minorities. When they hear the term conservative, Tea Party, Republican, they think racism. So what are we going to do about that? And one of the ideas was, we should call ourselves Frederick Douglass Republicans. Now, they happen to misspell both Frederick and Douglass. But it goes to show that what they're doing here is not thinking about how can we, put out ideas or policies and make decisions that would resonate within these communities, African Americans, Latinos, or whatever. No, they're thinking about how can we sell this stuff, which to me shows that they still don't get the depth of the problem. And of course, in a lot of these memos, they're ardently. This is the part of the conservative movement that is ardently anti-immigration reform, and they're thinking, how can we? There's a funny part in which immigration reform, they say, sounds good. Reform is a positive word. And, our side doesn't really, we don't have a way of calling this something, the anti-security bill, what can we call this? Schumer-Rubio, that will resonate with people in a negative way. What can we call the bill that will convey a negative message? And they kind of struggle.
They came up with Obama-gration, right?
Obama-gration, which I find it hard to say, but that's what they're trying to do. It still signals to me, as I just said, that they don't recognize the depth of their problems, in reaching certain aspects of our changing America.
Now, playing devil's advocate, is there any validity to some of them saying, we're conservative journalists, we're out with that, and we're just talking to people on background?
Well, if that's what they were doing, it's fine. But Steve Bannon, the head of, I think he's chief executive or CEO, whatever they call him, of Breitbart News, is an inviter to the meetings. You have, and I talked about Mark Tapscott getting involved and then pulling out because he thought it was inappropriate, the executive editor of the Washington Examiner. So I do think there are grades. Everything's not black and white. But I do, in this instance, I do believe that that the Breitbart people have crossed the line, and they're not just they're not covering these meetings. They're participating in the drafting of messaging and talking points, whatever you want to spin, while reporting on this stuff. And if they want to just and I thought Matthew Boyle would not respond to any comments about this. Mike Flynn of Breitbart did, and people can go to the story and read his comment and read the evidence I put out there. I thought he was being a little misleading. He said, "Oh, we're just at these meetings to cover them, the way we'd cover, we're reporters. We want to know what's happening." But the memos show that they're not just covering; they're active participants. And if they want to come out and say that, that's fine.
Now, outside of just journalists, there's also in the story pieces about legislative aides to senators like Ted Cruz being a part or communicating with the group and kind of taking a message to actual Congress people.
Yeah, there's a lot. The interesting thing is the points in this where there's intersection between these, conservative kvetches. I mean, they kvetch a lot about Republicans and about other conservatives, and allies on Capitol Hill. Max Pappas, who used to work at FreedomWorks and now works for Ted Cruz as one of his top aides, attends the meetings regularly. Danielle Cutrona, who is an aide, chief counsel to Senator Jeff Sessions, a very conservative senator from Alabama, who was on the Judiciary Committee, I believe. And she was one of the most active participants of the Google group page that they set up to communicate amongst themselves and post things. And there's one, I found one posting in which she sent around, to the members of Groundswell via the Google group, a column that had been posted at redstate.com, which is a very conservative site. And that column referred to Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham as Benedict Arnolds for supporting Chuck Hagel as nominee for Defense Secretary, and slammed them for treachery, big word, treachery, for supporting immigration reform. So here she is sending this out, obviously encouraging other members of the group to sort of pass along and adopt this message. And she's working for Jeff Sessions, one of their colleagues. So a Jeff Sessions aide is disseminating to this slice of the conservative movement, this attack on McCain and Graham. It's up to Senator Sessions, really, to figure out what he wants to do about that. To me, that looks a little bit dicey.
Yeah, and you actually, in the report, have something about, there was a messaging about Obama's putting politics before safety, and then it started... So one of the things they try to do is come up with these talking points, which can become hashtags. Like in the old days, people always looked for the right killer bumper sticker, right? Now we look for hashtags and talking points and one was, and they were looking for one that could work on multiple fronts. And so they came up with one referring to Obama, putting politics over safety. And you could use that on immigration. You can use that on national security. You could use that on sequestration. That and so they cook this up, and then you see, if you go out and Google this, it starts appearing in conservative op-eds, on talking points. It's in a Breitbart news story. It's in a Washington Times column, and at the meetings, this is what's kind of funny. I'm sure they did this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but at the meetings and in the messages, Ginni Thomas, one of the coordinators, hands out brownie points to those members of Groundswell who had a public deployment of this talking point, politics, putting politics over safety. So someone made it the title of their group newsletter that goes out to 50,000 activists. You get a brownie point for that, Tom. So this is what they're trying to do. And finally, what's the end game here? Obviously they're against liberals, but when you already have in Congress all these basically different tribes in the Republican Party, and now you have these, they're not really secret, but side groups. How is the Republican Party going to get its act together?
Well, I think this shows, in sort of the big landscape picture, the existence of Groundswell. That felt they even had to do this while there already are meetings like Grover Norquist's meeting and such of the conservative movement to plot exactly the same thing, messaging and strategy. They did that shows that there remain these deep fissures within the conservative movement and reflected in the Republican Party. You can just see the problems that John Boehner has as being, speaker. In fact, I do believe, Boehner, I think you can say this objectively in a lot of ways, is the weakest political leader in Washington since the Articles of the Confederation. I mean, he can just not keep his caucus behind a particular plan. And you have, tremendous infighting on immigration reform, and even on the budget stuff and how confrontational they should be with Barack Obama. Throughout the Groundswell memos, you see them, these conservatives bemoaning the fact that the conservatives in the House are not taking Boehner on enough. They want more confrontation with Boehner. They want Boehner to shut down the government. They want to have a debt ceiling showdown yet again. And they say over and over that the Republicans are clueless, and that their conservative allies, most of their conservative allies in the House, have been bought off and aren't being, harsh enough. So, if this is, if they represent a, part of the grassroots, part of the base of the party, it just shows that the party, even though they control the House, which they're able to hang on to now because they did a great job of gerrymandering, the party is still going to have a lot of problems at the national level. And for a presidential candidate, for for senators who have to run statewide, not in gerrymandered districts, and I think the long-term prospects for the Republicans, are not strong because they're not coming to terms with some very fundamental shifts in American society.
Be interesting to see how it plays out. You could see this at motherjones.com, correct?
That's true. And then people can follow me at davidcorn.com, where I tweet about all these sort of things.
Great. Well, thank you, David, and we will see what happens with this.
Thanks a lot.
Take care.